Everybody, this is Carmen DeValis with Doggies for Dementia, and today's show of Experts Dig In with Doggies for Dementia is Sarah Hyde-Williams, who is a dementia consultant and just an expert in many many areas. I'll just say that. But I really particularly love what you have to say about Lewy body disease. Hopefully y'all saw part one because there's a lot of great information and resources there. And welcome, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. So this episode, this is our part two. We're going to talk about what the family caregivers, the care partners, some key things they really need to know above and beyond the nuts and bolts of, what is Lewy body disease. So, what I thought would be really interesting if we just talk about what are some of the common things that the people who you consult with and who are in the support group share with you. What do you think one of those would be?
One of the most important that we see is adjusting expectations of what our loved one is able to do at this stage. Your role within either a spousal relationship or a child-parent relationship, that will change. I think really thinking through where we are at the moment and where we want to be, pick and choose our battles is a big one as well. So that adjustment is really hard for families.
Yes, definitely with all dementias. And then when you're adding symptoms to some of the paranoia and the hallucinations and some of the other things that happen, suddenly you're put into a role that you're not prepared for in any way, right?
Lewy body has some of those mood and those cognitive issues that deal a lot with hallucinations, delusions, illusions. My husband keeps saying that I'm cheating on him. So how do you work through that and reassure him that your relationship is solid? I think some of that comes from understanding the difference between caregiver and care partner.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I hear both terms out there and I've used them and sometimes interchangeably, but so for certain there are professional caregivers and family caregivers. And so what's the difference between care partner and caregiver?
I love to think of it as how much interaction and choice is given on the person living with dementia. So when we are caregiving, we are giving one-sided. This is what I'm doing for you. And it oftentimes builds emotions of guilt and resentment and anger. When we look at it from the side of care partner, we're in this together. We are both battling Lewy. It's not just you. You're not alone. I'm in this with you. That oftentimes works really well with spousal units when we say, we're in this together is a thought process in which that person living with Lewy body dementia has choice, and how that equality in that, how the rest of my life, quality of life is lived out. So important to think of the difference.
Yeah, so less than a label almost, then it's a mindset of how and by saying care partner, it sets us up to be more of that partner in life at that point or in that time of life versus being a caregiver, just simply giving and someone else's, their job is to just receive, not to participate.
Definitely. Yes? It also leads to thought processes for the person living with Lewy body disease that they're a burden.
Yes.
We don't ever want them to think that they are. They're oftentimes in spousal units, they're a partner for life. So is a diagnosis of this sort, we're still partners in this. I
Right.
will get you through this. We've lived 50 years together. I'm not leaving you now. So
Yeah.
it's a much different mindset.
Yeah, I tell you, when I think about the best examples of love that I've ever seen have been with families where something, Lewy body disease or Alzheimer's or, one of these very long, challenging courses, and how they're in it together, and then
Yeah.
stay in it together. And even when the other person appears to not be able to engage very much, I'm certain they can sense the love and protection that's there. I have no doubt in my
Yeah.
mind that energy is definitely palpable, whether they can express it or not.
There's one of my ladies in one of my support groups that her husband lived with Lewy Body Dementia for quite a few years before his death. And they had a running joke that whenever he had a hallucination, he'd say, "Do you see that in the corner?" And she'd go, "I think it's just Louie." And they would laugh about it, and they'd say, "Oh, it's just Louie. Don't worry about it. He's getting us again." And it was truly a beautiful moment that they shared together, that you're okay. You're okay.
Right.
We're in this
Mhm.
together. Yeah.
Yeah, and for some people, they know it's okay to bring it up, and they're not in the hallucination so much that they have some
It's a
reality. Or
safety.
yeah, definitely. That's really, yeah, that's really special. I wish that for every family going through. I know that some, it's not, when the person experiencing hallucination, it can be completely different for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So we're gonna work on our expectations, and
Right.
yeah. So anything else about expectations? What else should I expect?
That we should fully understand that there may be times to where we do have to take the lead in this, but educating ourselves enough to do that. Those expectations oftentimes are not set properly upon diagnosis, and therefore we think that nothing will change. Things will change in this. Your role may slightly change, but yet you're in this together is all I can say. That expectations oftentimes are that things will just continue on the same, or things have changed so drastically that now I'm giving full care.
I see.
And
Yeah,
so
and
one or the other.
yeah, we're talking about potentially a very many years, right?
Yes.
In many years in the course of the disease, depending on when it was diagnosed or when symptoms appeared and things. And
Yes.
so as there's a decline, because we already said, there's that nervous system and the physical, the way that we move our bodies and see things, depth perception, can and probably will
Right.
slowly get worse. Then, I think about families that I'm going from daughter to now almost the parent role, and it takes adjustment on both sides. Yes.
It does.
Yeah.
It does very much so on the care partner, in that child-parent relationship, and then also on the person living with dementia. I've always been the parent, don't tell me what to do.
Yes.
So I think it's how we approach it, how we learn tips and tricks on having those conversations is important as well.
Yeah. And I think that might be a topic for another conversation, because I think that's a big one, and is a huge challenge, because it's something I think every caregiver or care partner goes through, the change in roles. And
yes,
how is that processed? And it really is just so dependent on where they're both at, where
yes,
people are at.
very much so. And what the relationship has always been like.
Yes.
that is part of that dynamic that we need to look at, is has the relationship always been a very loving relationship, or have there already been disagreements or resentments built into many years, and we are now stepping into the role of caregiver, care partner in providing that type of care for however long this disease process lasts.
Yeah, and
Very
it's
important
just
as well.
so important. I mean, I've known of couples that had a stable, good marriage. I'm thinking about two in particular. They both married a little bit later in lives. One,
Yes.
she said he was the love of her life. That's all there was. And then another one where their marriage hadn't been so great. He was really controlling all the time, but she thought, well, I'm in this and I'm going to stick with this. And then when he developed symptoms of dementia, the control and the anger and things got bigger. And then she's like, wow, I can't be the wife who leaves my husband with dementia. However, the misery level just went up for her so much. And then she was the identified, yes, and she was the identified caregiver. And so whole different feeling on how they each felt about being that care partner. And really, I think one was more of a care partner, one was more of a caregiver, if we were going to label it that way. And so, yeah, tough stuff. A lot of things to consider, because not every relationship is good to start with.
Absolutely. And when I do a consultation with a family, I typically ask, how has the marriage been? Tell me about their marriage. How long have they been married? Or maybe if it's a parent-child relationship, have you been close all of these years? It's something to consider. Yeah.
It's huge, really. It's hard to talk about or to admit it or to say it out loud, but it's huge. Yeah, so I guess along those lines then, let's talk about, so if, how do we explain this? So usually it's one identified care partner, caregiver in the family. Then how best do they explain this to others who, Lewy body is one of these that the experiences can sometimes be very frightening and, even physically aggressive or, and these kind of things. And the thought is, he's always been prone to anger and now it's even worse. You got to get out of there. And then another one says, you married for life. You promised you would, for better, for worse. Here you are. And the understanding that there's a disease in here too. How do we talk about Lewy body? It's,
first and foremost, we educate ourselves. Do we have a good grasp on what we're looking at, what the course of the disease process will be? And we talked in our previous session about good support groups, great materials, good websites. There's a couple of really good books I recommend on Lewy body dementia as well. So educating ourselves, but when we speak about it to others and when we explain this, first and foremost, they are a person living with an illness. Mm-hmm. And so they're not doing it out of spite. Yes, personality might have dictated some anger or some traumatic events throughout their life, but we're still working with a disease state that causes some even more challenging behaviors. And so if we can explain it in essence, this is a disease process. It's going to be a little bit more challenging, and it's the disease process, not the individual actually doing this maliciously. Mm-hmm. And so to have a separation of what that looks like, it's the Lewy coming out is an awful lot of what my family say. It's the Lewy.
Yes.
But yes, but not losing sight of who they've always been. We still have our same personalities, our same tendencies toward either loving or not so loving, but we have a disease process that's causing some changes in the brain that will cause differences in mood, personality, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. So if you've got a family or, a couple, and it's gotten to the point where perhaps it's not safe for either or both, and the even with the, say, it's the disease, not the person. However, they're coming at me with knives, or they're certain that they're accusing me of things that aren't true, and they get very, very upset, and the police are being called by either, because sometimes it's the person with Lewy body who's calling the police and saying there's a stranger in my house, then they need to go, and
Yes.
things like that. Where is that line in the sand, or is there? What do families say when they come to you to say, I think it's maybe time to consider placement, or do they?
They do. And I find two camps in essence. Either it frankly is a safety issue. And some of the things we think about when we think of safety issue, are they running out of the house down the street in the middle of the night, thinking they're somewhere else, or they're confused. Another thing that we need to think of are there sharp objects? Are there weapons in the house? Are they of danger to themselves or others? Other things to consider might be chemicals we have in the home. Might we mistaken bleach that we've left on the side of the laundry? We turned our back to go do something else, and before you know it, they're thinking it's a glass of water. So many safety measures, and that's first and foremost. Always, always, always safety when I talk to a family.
Mm-hmm. Because frankly,
Other times,
anything can be a weapon at any time. There are
very
some
much,
obvious ones, but yeah.
yes. Other things that caregivers come to me for is they're not sleeping at night. They're up all night. The insomnia is just horrific, but they're sleeping all day. But I can't go to sleep because I can't leave them alone. And therefore, they are so run down. There is a statistic that for every person living with dementia, no matter what type of dementia, it takes roughly 2.5 to 3 people. I don't know where they came up with the half person, but somewhere between 2.5 and 3 people to care for that person. You have to sleep. You have to regenerate. And so oftentimes it's a caregiver, a care partner in this that is just so worn out, they just can't go on anymore. Something has to give. And so they are looking at secondary setting for their loved one, and what type of setting can they be successful at an assisted living type environment, or do we need to look at a dementia care community, oftentimes called memory care.
Right. And there's just so much guilt and shame. Those two, guilt is I'm doing a bad thing because I made a promise, or I don't feel like a good wife for doing this, or the shame, I am a bad person for not being able to. Yeah. And then, we've got also society pressures out there, because people who haven't done it, will say, well, you don't work, that's all you do is take care of him or take care of her. Why is that so hard? That's because they clearly have never done it, or they would know better.
Correct.
And there's just a lot. So and by the time I think families make that, or I would say those that would come to me, I think they welcome me to say the line in the sand is safety here. And I think it's time to start thinking about placement. It was almost a relief, because then they can say, my nurse practitioner, my doctor told me it was time, versus I think it's time. And I felt that was a gift that I was giving them. So
it is.
Yeah.
I oftentimes wrap that in the package of, in my professional opinion, I do believe that we are at that point. Oftentimes we also are going down that road toward that when a family is even questioning the safety, or when they're beginning to think that may be an option. we're at that point.
Yes.
So we at least need to put it on the table and discuss it so that we know if we've discussed it prior with that person living with dementia, we know what their wants and wishes are. Also balancing that against caregiver burnout and safety measures.
Oh yeah.
It's a hard decision.
Yeah, and before a crisis time where, you know,
Yes,
if possible,
always before a crisis. Yeah,
yeah, because then no decision of this is easy. There's no way either of us could ever say any piece of this is easy. However, you add a crisis to it and it just becomes incredibly difficult to think clearly and to maybe make the best choice for everybody. And
absolutely.
Yeah, I think that piece that we just about even whether to stay or change caregiver, you know, maybe someone else in the family, perhaps, because there's just so much associated with that, and anyone who's been in a relationship where they have felt abused, whether it's the person a disease, you know, maybe they're going through a really, really hard time and they're angry and resentful and it comes out, but it still doesn't make it okay that you put yourself in danger too, right? Whether it's the disease
considering all the emotions surrounding this, can I be the best care partner that I can be to my loved one? And am I the right person to do that?
Right. And is it the best thing for me too right now? Yeah.
Yes.
We all know our parents, if they're siblings, will respond differently to different siblings, different children, right? So sometimes the switch up is what is needed to just to kind of change gears a little bit, and whether it's for either one, just for the best for the situation.
Definitely.
Yeah. And again, there's always just so much guilt around that, or brings up a lot of history.
Yes, I promised mom and dad I would never put them in a home. I hear that an awful lot.
Yes.
That one's a tough one. It's a tough one. I know that there's a lot wrapped up in making that decision. Yeah. But things change and we have to weigh safety and can I be that best caregiver? Is it best for my loved one? Is it best for me? Like you said very well, absolutely. All that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I've watched recently more than a couple of us, some documentaries, and one in particular followed a gentleman taking care of his wife. And in the beginning, he said, "Oh, there is no way I'm going to take care of her." And they had talked about it. And however, then at the end, as she's toward the end of life and he's exhausted, he had a stroke or something, he was ill, they ended up doing some placement in order for him to get some rest and take care of himself and things. But when they met with him afterwards, he said, I really, really wish I hadn't have made that promise, because it was so much harder than I could have ever imagined. And if there was any way possible, I would have been there for her. And it wasn't a lack of love. It was just a lack of being able to manage it without sleeping or resting and things.
You said an interesting phrase I'd like to pick up on. I promised her I would always care for her. You never promised where.
Right, define care.
If you place, and if you find a secondary setting that someone can take the bulk of those, what we oftentimes called activities of daily living, all that hardcore caregiving, care partnering, you're still her husband. You're still the wife. You're still a child. You're still caring for them. You didn't break that promise.
Right.
But it looks slightly different than how we had it in our mind. Yeah. You're still honoring that promise.
You sure are. And I think when I was writing my book, and there are 13 families I follow, there was one story in particular with regard to this I will never forget. And she said, it came down to it, and they had a really just a magical type love for one another. And she said it came down to it where I had a choice. I could be his wife and love him and be there for him in that way, or I could be his caregiver and be
That's
delivering
right.
the daily care that he needed. And or I could find placement where I could be there as much as I want. I can be there and still love him and be his wife. And I could do whatever caregiving I wanted to as a display of love and affection. But I also had the choice of not doing that. And that was huge.
That's a beautiful story. Very well said. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just never forgot that. I thought that's a beautiful display of love,
Yes.
and in saying I am going to find someone else to take care of you that I know and trust, and that I'm going to be there all the time, and I love you enough to be there to love you.
I love that.
Yeah, and that's something I've never forgotten, and that I try to use whenever possible for people to help
Yes.
ease that burden, because it's a big burden. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a big thing around, and how do we talk to our families about that? And I have had a few guests talk about how do we get together and talk as a family, and it always comes down to we should talk about it before again.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
To have those family meetings and know what wishes are, and how to put those things in place.
Yeah, and if need be, have a mediator to help, because if there's siblings don't always get along and don't have the same, their
Oh,
personality types, and there's a
that's
lot of
right.
history there. A lot
There
of history.
is.
Yes.
There is.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with having a mediator helping to make sure that everyone's respected in their wishes and come to good conclusions.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, so family-wise and people are at home, so we're saying safety is that line in the sand, and
Often for most families it is.
safety for either the person who's doing the caring, or the person who has the dementia. Yes,
Yes.
safety. Yeah. um, and so I'm wondering, for Lewy body disease, is that any different than other dementias when we're thinking about placement? Are we looking at different things?
It really is. We want to ask specific questions about training of their staff.
Mm-hmm.
We want to make sure that they are well trained in. Let me back up a little bit and say, memory care communities, or dementia care communities, like I like to call them, do have additional training hours per year, per the Texas Health and Human Services. That's their licensure. So I always advise, my favorite thing is a standalone dementia care community that's all they do.
That's all they
And they're
do.
very good at that. They train their people well, and they have those additional tools, those tips and tricks under their belt oftentimes when we get those challenging, I like to call them expressions rather than behaviors. When we have those challenging expressions that come along with Lewy body disease, those hallucinations, the delusions, oftentimes the frequent falls, those types of things, so that we're looking out for it as a preventative measure, oftentimes in community type settings, rather than just reacting to not being fully educated on how to care for that person.
Right.
So I would always ask about education, how much additional training do their people get, and I really love standalone dementia care communities. I think they do a phenomenal job. That's all they do.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. One thing to let's see, just skipped my mind what I was going to say. But oh, for education, I'm going to say too, oftentimes families are the expert on their loved one. And
Always.
for them not to lose track of that, and it is okay to say, these are his routines, these are what he
Yes.
likes, what he doesn't. And because everybody is unique, every person, dementia or not, we're all unique. And the families are the experts on that person if they can't speak for themselves. And that's an important thing.
Having a really good discussion before you move them to that community, and knowing that the staff all have that living history going in, that when a certain song is played, here might be the reaction, or they don't like to be touched.
Mm-hmm.
That's interestingly enough. Or their favorite phrase is such, or they like to be called Bob instead of Robert. Those little things that are very, that the family knows best.
Right.
The community doesn't know them unless the family shares it with them.
Mm-hmm.
So to have that open, honest conversation about likes and dislikes and preferences before they even make that move is imperative.
Yes, it's respect, right? I mean, it's respect, and it's the way everybody would want to be treated, because we all have our particular likes and dislikes. And
Yeah.
yeah. So I want to mention before we go to, as far as you just mentioned, standalone memory cares, and so the difference between assisted living memory care. It's so confusing, right? And then there's memory care, but are all assisted livings memory care? Are all memory cares assisted livings? And what's the difference? And what should they ask?
That is a phenomenal question, and I educate folks a lot of times. All memory care is assisted living. Not all assisted living is memory care. So think of it as an umbrella term, and you've got two service lines in essence under that umbrella. You've got assisted living, which traditionally we think of as physical needs, mm-hmm. and memory care or dementia care, in which we oftentimes think of cognitive needs. Mm-hmm. So in essence, all of it is licensed the same under Texas Health and Human Services, but memory care per se is kind of that step up that has additional training and does only cognitive or those types of needed support. It's a step up from traditional standalone regular assisted living.
Right. So someone who's in sense. Right, someone who needs help with their medicines and maybe shouldn't be cooking anymore, or it's too taxing to cook, they can go for meals. And then I would assume then people who are in assisted living who start to show symptoms of cognitive loss or memory problems, or that are getting worse, because that can happen. They might be there for a while, right? And dementia might.
It does.
Alzheimer's or usually as Alzheimer's could start at their 80s, and they've lived there for a little bit already, and so they might just get moved to memory care then for their safety. Was it safety then?
Oftentimes for safety, and typically what an assisted living that line in the sand they draw is, at any given point in time, would that person walk out that front door and be in an unsafe situation?
Yeah.
So to where memory care or dementia care communities would be secured. I don't like the word locked. It is secured for their own safety, but they're not able to simply walk out that front door. Mm-hmm. So if they can successfully live end of life in assisted living with some cognitive difficulties, then that's a great environment. Mm-hmm. It's there might be that possibility that they may go out of that safe environment. That is something we need to look at.
Right. And I guess that's individual again too. So if you've got someone who does better with closer supervision that they would have in memory care, so they get out of the room and participate more, where otherwise maybe in a larger assisted living, they might tend to sleep the day away and not realize it. Yeah, it's a lot of things
How
to
much
think about.
support do they need through that course of disease? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So much to think about, Sarah. I have to thank you so much for, I mean, these are tough topics we're talking about, and can be much longer conversations. And I'm really, really grateful for having this time to spend with you today and for your knowledge. And to certain we'll have your information and any references we have spoken about in the descriptions of the video.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you all for watching Experts Dig In with Doggies for Dementia. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.